Hello everyone, welcome back. The topic which we are going to discuss in this lecture is one of the important stuff. Not only in Python, as I always say, there are certain things it's very important and common all across the languages. So what was that? The one which we are going to discuss is nothing but exception handling. So exception handling, what is exception handling? When we write some programs, there are certain scenarios we can expect some exceptions or some errors in some places. There are some other places we will never aware of will get an exception in this particular area. So there are two things, known errors or unknown errors. Known errors, that means there will be error will be coming in this particular block of the code, and the other thing is when you run some programs, there are some issues it will come at the runtime. Okay, that is also an exception. We can simply say that's a runtime exception, is the interpreter time exception or compile time exception. Okay, so one of the important thing about exception handling, there are different types of exception. So we need to know which exception or when to use. Okay, let's see what is the syntax in Python, how we are going to define a try and an exception block. Okay, so as a starting, you need to know three things. The first thing is try. So what is try? Execution, execution of code. You can simply say block of code. And except, block lets you handle the exception or error. And there will be another thing which we need to know. Finally, so if any exception comes in the try block, the program automatically move to the exception block and it will send the error message, throw back the error message. So I didn't get any error message in try, so it will successfully executed. But why do we need a finally? Finally, this is a block lets you execute the code whether you're getting exception or not. That means you can simply say finally block will always execute. Doesn't matter whether it has an exception or not. Okay, you can simply say it always execute. Okay, let's try with a simple script. Okay, let me create a new file, or let me create a new folder, not here. Here, exception handling. So under the exception handling, I'm going to create a new file. Okay, what happened? Okay, Under the exception, I'm going to create a simple exception script dot py. So what is the syntax? Try and execute something here, or some code, and accept exception. This is the simple syntax of the try and the catch. Okay, let's assume any known issues. We all know anything by 0, it's infinity, right? That is mathematically not possible. If you want, let's open the calci and try 10 divided by 0. Cannot divide by 0. This is an exception, right? So let's see how it is going to be handled. Okay, let's get some input. So number 1 is equal to get the input from the user, enter num1, and number 2. So let me write some code here. Result is equal to num1 divided by num2. Print the result. So here exception occurred. Okay, this is simple, right? So let's run this and we'll see what is happening. So enter the number 1. Number 1 is, let's try the positive scenario. 0, and number 2 is 10. Exception occurred. Why? Because that is what we discussed here. 0 by anything is 0. Okay, something is wrong here. Num1, what is 0 divided by 10? Okay, this is an int. I need to convert it to int first thing. Save it. So why it is exception occurred here? Because the first time I didn't convert the input as an integer, because only the numerical data can be divided, right? So or else it's considered as a string. What is string divided by string? That's not possible, right? That's an exception. Okay, now it's a valid scenario. Okay, let's run this again. Right click and run Python. Enter number 1, 0 and 10. So 0 dot 0, that's a valid scenario. Let's run it again and we'll try some invalid scenario. That means anything by 0. So 10 divided by 0. So exception occurred. So we know what is the exception here. It is an arithmetic exception, right? The reason is number cannot divided by 0. If you run this, it will make sense. Ten 0. So number cannot divide by 0. So because this is a known scenario, I know what could be the issue. What is the possibility of the issue? Okay, and as I said, finally. So why do we need a finally? Whether the exception occurred or not, the finally will be always executed. So let's print something here, calculation done. Right click and run Python again, enter the number 1. Let's see the valid scenario. 0 divided by 10, calculation done. Finally block still executed. Let's try again. So this time 10 divided by 0. Number cannot divided by 0. Okay, and also the calculation then the finally block will be executed. Okay, so this is a simple try and catch and the finally. Okay, in the next video let's discuss about some in detail concept in the in exception handling. So let's see each other next video. Thank you. Hello everyone, welcome back. Okay, so are we handling the exception properly here? It may look like we had handled the exception properly, but it doesn't. So when the first time when we run the particular method, it is a string, and string divided by string is something wrong, so exception occurred. But the same exception message has been returned. Okay, there might be possible the same block of code, it might throw some different kind of exception. Not only this number cannot divide by 0 exception, there might be some other exception also. So in this scenario we need to handle the exception in a proper way. If it is a known error message, we need to find out what is the exception type and we need to use that. Okay, so if you're not aware what are the exceptions are existing, just do one thing, go to the Python documentation and go to the search and search for exception, and there you can find it, built-in exceptions. Here you can find all of them. There are a lot of error. See, arithmetic error. The base class is for those built-in exceptions. This error rise for the various arithmetic errors like overflow error and zero division error and floating point error. The one which we handled, zero division error. So it comes under arithmetic error. So we need to handle the arithmetic error. How are you doing that? Just copy this and go to your script and handle use arithmetic error. We can have the multiple exception blocks because we'll have a different kind of exception, right? Except and you can see some other exception here. Okay, now this looks clear. So my program will come here and it will see whether it's a proper, and if it is improper it will go to the exception block, and I'm handling a specific error message or specific exception type here. If the exception is the same type, this block will be executed saying like the number cannot divide by 0. Okay, let's try that. So 0 divided by 10, 0, and the calculation is done. It's a positive scenario. Let's try the negative scenario. 10 divided by 0. See, number cannot divided by 0. But this exception block is not executed because any one of the exception block will be executed. Here I specifically handle the error message, arithmetic error. So it will only check the arithmetic error is occurred in this particular block, then it will execute this exception, or else it will go to some other exception. Okay, so what we can do, so for number 1 and number 2 I'm going to do something strange here. I'm going to comment distance and I'm going to put some string here 10, 15. Save it and run it now. See, now you got some other exception. You are not getting the number cannot divided by 0 error, because we know that those are string values. You cannot divide at the strings. That is where this kind of exception will takes place. If you know the error type, you can specifically handle it, or you don't know the exception message or exception type, you can handle it here. Okay. So the finally, as I said, it always executed whether it's an exception or not. It always executed. Okay. So what are the other scenarios which we can check here? Okay. So for example, I'm working with the files. Okay, how I'm going to handle the exception files. We already did something for the files, right? Read file. Let's copy something from here. Okay, I'm going to use this file. Okay, file name. For example, xyz.txt. So what happened? I'm trying to read the file. Okay, and the file dot read. So let's comment all of them. So let's see only these three code snippet. Let's clear the console. Let's run this. See, no such file or directory. So there is some exception here, because we know that here there is a possibility of file not found error. Correct? Let's keep that in a try block. And also we need to keep a exception block. Print some exception, because we know that there might be a possibility of file is not existing error, but still I'm making this code change and I'm running it again. Some exception, but it does not specify what kind of exception, because it's a known scenario. When you're working with some files, there is a possibility that maybe the file may not be existing. Okay, so we need to find out what is the type of the file not found. So go to the documentation and you can find different kind of exceptions here. These are all exceptions. So let's find something relevant to the file not. Okay, here file not found exception. Raised when a file or directory is requested but does not exist. This is the scenario which we are talking about. Okay, let's copy the exception block and paste it here. And then now copy the same block and handle the another kind of exception. So here it's a common exception block. And let's have a finally here just to print file processed. Save it. Now we handle the two different kind of exceptions here. So now let's run this. Invalid syntax finally. Save it and run it again. Wait a second, finally. Okay, it's my bad. Now what is happening? Some exception. Okay, so here I didn't modify the error message. file not found exception. Run it again. Now you can see the valid error message, file not found exception, and the finally block file processed. So this is better program. Instead of handling a try catch block without knowing what is that and what is going to be the possible error message, and these are the known scenarios which we can identify easily. Okay. Similarly, there are a lot of error message. Is a directory error to check whether the directory or it's not a directory, or as I said, not a directory, and permission denied error. When you're trying to access some file or folder, if you don't have enough privileges to open the file, it will throw the error message. Because there are tons and tons of things in the exception area. You need to go through each one of them. But not now. So you need to handle this exception based on the requirements or based on the needs. Because we always never need all kind of exception handled in the same program or same projects. There are specific projects needed specific exception handling. Okay, so we need to find which exception and when to use that. This is the important things about the file. The exceptions. Okay, so what else there in the exception? Okay, so now let's think about this scenario. I have a try block and I have an exception block. I don't have any exception in my particular code block. So what will happen? Nothing. It will execute the try block and it will end the program. Okay. But in Python we have option. You can use the else block for a try. So what will happen if you use else? You can use the else keyword to define a block of code to be executed if no errors were raised. So what does that mean? If you don't have any if you don't have any exception in your program, the else block will be executed. It's similarly like finally, but finally will always execute, but else block only will be execute if it is no error. Can you try that? Yeah, let's try that. Let's comment this. Let's create simple program. Try print hello Python. There's no possibility of error here. Let's handle the exception here. Some print some exception. This is the powerful way of handling the else block here. Print nothing wrong here. Let's run this. See, hello Python and nothing wrong here. Since I don't have any exceptions in my block, it will directly went to the else. Okay, so what is the difference between finally and the else? The finally will execute even if I have any errors here, but the else block only will be execute if there is no error in my try block. Okay, just give it a try because this is the important stuff about the exception handling and all, because when you start working on the projects, whether the code logic might have some flaws, but the exception handling has to be perfect. Okay, so what else you can here also in this sample example, right? So we are working with some files. So finally what you can do is when you open a file, it needs to be closed, right? So whether the exception handled or not, or exception occurred or not, you need to close the file. So you can keep that in a finally block. So this makes sense, right? This is how you need to think about how to handle this scenario. So I'm working with the files. So I know there is a possibility of file not found error, and there is a possibility of runtime exception, so which we don't know, and the finally block will always execute it. So why we need to keep only simply say file processed, as well as you can close the file as well. The similar way when you're opening a connection, okay, the connection block will be here, and all the database process you will be processing here. So once everything is done, you can have the final block to close the connection and commit the cursor, or sorry, commit the connection or and close the cursor. So those scenarios you can make use of the finally block. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed this chapter, and please do some exercise on it, because it looks simple, but there are tons and tons of exception types available. We don't know when we need to use what kind of exception. So it will come only in a practice. Okay, so let's see each other in the next video. Thank you.
I'm an icon, man. And my girl about a 10. I should fuck her in the Benz.